Welcome tonight's Live with Littlewood, where we're going to take a free market take on the various stories of the week. It seems that the rest of Britain is apparently focused on the great debate between Colin and Cuthbert, which is, according to The Guardian, a class issue that we must all take a side on. No, me neither. I have no side to take on Colin and Cuthbert. But on tonight's Live with Littlewood, we'll be discussing the issues that really matter from a free market perspective. So coming up on tonight's show, the European Super League and what free marketers should make of it and its apparent failure. Also, will a government-enforced vegan diet soon be close to mandatory, with Boris Johnson's new pledge to reduce UK carbon emissions? And is our labour market now so flexible that unemployment isn't really a problem anymore, and neither should it be a top policy priority? On tonight's show, I'll be joined by Kate Andrews, the economics correspondent at The Spectator, and by Tom Whipple, my first cousin and science editor at The Times. We're also being joined by reaction editor Iain Martin, political commentator Benedict Spence, and from the home team, our own IEA editorial and research fellow, Professor Len Shackleton. All that coming up on tonight's Live with Littlewood. Here we are. Well, it's all been kicking off. Overnight, the European Super League appears to have collapsed, with all of the English teams withdrawing, but the government still looks to be pushing ahead with plans to introduce further regulation of football ownership and what football clubs can do. To help us pick this apart, I'm joined by reaction editor Iain Martin. Iain, how are you? Good evening to you.
Great to be joining you.
And political commentator Benedict Spence. Benedict, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good indeed. So, Benedict, let me start with you. You're a devout fan, I believe, of the Merseyside Reds franchise in the
Red Sox,
putative Euro soccer Super Bowl fest. What was your reaction to, the attempted launch of this new Euro Super League and its collapse within 48 hours?
Not only am I a fan, but way back in the black and white days, my great-grandfather was chairman of Liverpool Football Club. And I can sort of see it from both sides, from the perspective of the money men and from the average fan on the street. Sadly, I'm not my great-grandfather and don't have any shares in the club anymore. But I was sort of filled with a sense of real dread when I heard the story break, as I think a lot of people were. The issue, I think, is not so much the idea of elite European competition. You know, we've already got that with the Champions League. And one of the things that the clubs were saying, which I think was totally legitimate, is that UEFA is run essentially like a cartel. It has a complete monopoly over all European competition at the moment, and it keeps an inordinate amount of the money for itself. I think the key issue that I had specifically was the closedness of the league, the closed aspect, the lack of competition. And what this basically is the league, for those who aren't currently aware, because it is a little bit complex, the new European Super League was going to be sort of set up to run as, instead of the Champions League, it was going to be run between these 15 permanent clubs, plus 5 clubs that were going to get invited every year at the discretion of the 15. And there was no way that you could qualify for it necessarily, automatically, based on your performance. You had to sort of meet the criteria set by the clubs. And I think this is the thing that really got fans goat. A lot of fans dislike the Champions League in the way that it's done, and they want to see reform. But this isn't the sort of reform that they wanted to see, because it is essentially a lack of competition. It is, barring any sort of club that isn't an established club from ever sort of reaching the upper echelons. The money that was involved in this new European Super League was going to be an initial payment of about 300 million, followed by installments of about 200 million plus every year. but the clubs all wanted to be allowed to compete in their domestic leagues as well. So let's just think about that. You've got this group of teams who are already financially doped compared to the rest of their competitors that are going to have this additional hundreds of millions pumped into their system every year. And they get to decide, they get to deign whether or not somebody else has access to that, not based on how well they do, just whether or not they meet the criteria. Well, again, that is just, there is no way that that can really be drawn up as fair competition, as sport. And we do need to remember that this is sport. It's not just a business. It's sort of, it spans realms. A lot of people sort of think of it as sort of a quasi-religious, sort of quasi-social aspect rather than just a business aspect. So I don't think it's as straightforward as a lot of free marketers would otherwise say. I think of saying, well, these are the biggest, these are the biggest fish in the pond. You've got to let them sort of compete, and you've got to let them go, as it were. I don't think it's as straightforward as that. There are deep ties to communities that do literally go back centuries. And I think certainly if you were to look at it from the perspective of the government, this is a cause for a lot of concern, government intervention in sport. At a time, I think, when this Conservative government is being asked to be a lot more conservative in terms of its attitude towards things like culture and the fabric of communities, well, football clubs play a very big part in that. Yeah. Do you want to be the Prime Minister who oversees the breakup of traditional football structures in this country? I think that is, we've already seen how angry people get about statues which are dead. Think about the living, breathing ecosystem of football. That's a lot more damaging going forward.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm as regular viewers to this show, or indeed anyone who's ever met me will know, I'm a devout Southampton fan. I thought this was a daft idea, but I guess if those 6 clubs had left and joined the ESL and been kicked out of the Premier League, finally, one of my annual bets on Southampton winning the Premier League might come good. It wouldn't be a dream anymore. And Iain, you're a fan of Rangers. There could have been 6 slots opening up in the English Premier League. You and Celtic could have, be playing at St Mary's against Southampton, be a good competitive match, wouldn't it? What did you make of this whole fiasco and farrago over the past 48 hours?
Yeah, I should point out, it's Glasgow Rangers, not Queen's Park Rangers that I'm a fan of. And I was just rather insulted that we weren't invited to take part in this sort of dirty dozen. But anyway, never mind. And I think you're right that a lot of people in Scotland, or Rangers and Celtic fans, have hoped for 20 years or so, and that moment's now gone, that that Rangers and Celtic could have joined the English Premier League, and there was a point where it might have happened where it just didn't quite, pre-financial crisis. I mean, I think it's been a really encouraging, energizing spectacle, this actually, because, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about what it means in terms of markets, and I think it goes to the heart of something. Steve on the IEA blog wrote a really interesting piece about what this signifies. But in terms of pure market power and consumer action, is pretty impressive what happened. And I know, of course, the government was involved, and so was the Spanish government and the football authorities, but just the sheer force of it was really led by fan power and by consumer power. So when people are saying this is all about greed, well, sure, fine, but you need your paying public to want the product enough to actually to buy it. And it became clear within hours, actually, just by Monday morning, that this was not something which fans or lovers of football were going to want to buy. And it was fascinating to see how it was killed by consumer power and some media intervention, and then the politicians sensing which way it was going and having to join in. Yeah, so
I actually think, because I think it was a duff product, I believe in the right of businesses and football clubs to bring duff products to market, but they will be judged by the market. And it looks like the market, this is almost a triumph of free market capitalism. In 48 hours, a product or service has been killed off, as you rightly say, Iain, by the fans. But I'd like to get your take on whether the government has any role here. I'm getting more and more annoyed. There seems to be no aspect of our lives in which the government isn't involved. And we'll put up on the YouTube screen a tweet from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He says, earlier, Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, and I met with representatives from the FA, the Premier League and football fan groups to discuss action against the proposed European Super League. He goes on to say, no action is off the table. No action is off the table.
Nuclear strike?
We are exploring every possibility to ensure these proposals are stopped. Now, as Iain rightly says, fan power has stopped it. The reaction amongst the fans, the customers, I guess, in a market system has stopped it already. Oliver Dowden said, we will do whatever it takes to stop the European Super League. I mean, this is ludicrous, isn't it, Benedict? Politicians getting involved in this. What are we talking about? A tactical nuclear strike on the Etihad Stadium? I mean, this is absolutely moronic. I wouldn't have minded so much if they said there could be a cartel issue here. We're going to ask the Competitions and Market Authority to perhaps take a look at it. But that's not what they're saying. No action is off the table. We'll do whatever it takes. This is insanity. Politics has invaded too much into our lives, hasn't it, in this area?
Yeah, I think there is an element. I mean, it's sort of typical of, I think, this government and politics more broadly at the moment to use very sort of overarching and quite bombastic language. But I think the sort of the outrage that you got, and I thought that this was rather cleverly done by certain individuals, people like Gary Neville, sort of saying, write to your MP, make a bit of a thing about this on Monday Night Football on Sky, when everybody was tuning into a watch Leeds, everybody else hoped Leeds were going to bash Liverpool because they were all so angry with them. And sort of he had that platform and he said, you need to write to your MPs and you need to do, and so I thought that was rather clever, because then it becomes less a sort of a government interference thing, because actually if you've got all of these fans actually getting in touch with their MPs and saying, no, we want you to interfere with this, well, then I suppose even a supposed liberals in these governments will be sitting there going, well, this is what people want. And that, of course, has been a great part of the strategy throughout the pandemic, of course, is everybody saying, well, hang on, why are you intervening in our lives? And the government turning around and saying, well, these measures are popular. We've got the polling that says so. So, I think it's, if you're a free marketer, if you're sort of a lover of liberty, it might be very concerning, but it is ever so interesting that appears to be the direction that we're going in, that people are sort of, they've got this sense that things are being taken away from them, being safety or being this element, football, part of their community, their sort of their weekly entertainment, and they want somebody else to step in. They want a higher power to stop it from being eroded. And whether or not they need it is another thing, because as you rightly point out, this was a predominantly fan power, although I don't think we should underestimate the role that a national government saying we're going to stop this has on 6 chairmen saying, oh, hang on, we hadn't considered that. Nobody thought that was going to happen. We just thought it was going to be the fans that we were dealing with. You shouldn't rule that out. But ultimately, yeah, it is predominantly, this has been driven by fans, by market forces. But I suppose also if you're Boris Johnson, you're going to take this opportunity to score some cheap points, to get yourself some political credit, because the second he comes out and he says, we're going to do whatever we can to stop it. Well, if it does actually fall flat based on nothing to do with him, just because the fans say we're going to boycott it, the players say we want nothing to do with it, well, that doesn't harm him in the slightest. And he hasn't actually lifted a finger. But as you're right, as a sort of somebody who likes people to be a little bit more sensible, you'd say, well, can't the government look at pre-existing measures that would already have raised flags about this, rather than saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce all kinds of unspecified new measures to try to stop this. I mean, as I said at the start, this is just a reversion to the type of bombastic rhetoric that governments now like to employ, because it gets people going, because it gets people on side, because it makes them feel that that they're on their side.
But I find this terrifying. I mean,
it is. It absolutely is.
Look, you might be on the right side, but the idea this is a matter for government legislation. I mean, what next?
I can see
full-scale public inquiry into the application of the offside rule. That's something that fans have looked at. Iain, isn't this the classic example of, as it turned out in this case, unnecessary but massive government overreach, far beyond them having an opinion or just wanting to be culturally on the right side, threatening enormous state action if football isn't organised in a way that Boris Johnson and Oliver Dowden try and second guess the fans want?
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, when Boris was running for the Tory leadership, libertarian friends of mine would try and present him almost as a libertarian, or certainly as a classical liberal in certain respects. He's certainly a libertine, but and Boris can be whatever you want him to be while he was trying to become Tory leader. But he represents something very different. And I think this goes absolutely to the heart of where our politics is now. I share some of your concerns, Mark, but ultimately this is Brexit. This is the politics of Brexit. And what Brexit represented, an emphasis on the national over the supranational, a sense of connection, an attempt to assert identity in an increasingly globalized world of the same brands. Is LVMH really a French, a French brand in any conceivable way, as Steve wrote on the IEA blog earlier this week? And that is a tension which has been at the heart of conservative and liberal politics since the late 1970s and early 1980s, that Margaret Thatcher was simultaneously interested, for obvious reasons, in the national and the patriotic, but also prioritized open and free markets. In a way, it's impossible to resolve. There isn't a definitive sort of textbook answer you apply to every single case. Was Margaret Thatcher right to block HSBC, I think it was, trying to take over the Royal Bank of Scotland in the early 1980s because she thought that RBS, or she was persuaded by George Younger, that had some sort of national characteristic, or it was perceived to be important by voters? And the centre-right, the free market, has never satisfactorily resolved that. And Brexit brings all of that to the fore again, especially when the Conservative Party is governing on the back of an incredible new coalition of interests, having reached into working class England and united much of the southeast with large parts of the north, where those notions of the particular, the local, the national, the patriotic resonate. So that's why I think they jumped on it straight away. They knew what this signified, a sort of remote billionaire, rootless globalist class changing the national game.
Yeah, I get that. And obviously, I mean, I'm a passionate football fan, and, I wouldn't go so far as say football's the national religion, but it's not far off. And I get that, politicians want to associate themselves with that. And of course, I mean, it wasn't Harold Wilson who said that England only ever win the World Cup when Labour is in government. Of course, England only ever won the World Cup once, so you might not consider there is a sufficient data set to draw firm conclusions there, but nevertheless, he wanted to associate himself with that winning thing. But Iain, I want to come back to something that you were saying earlier about this greed thing, because this is what worries me. That I can even understand government ministers saying, football has some sort of cultural thing. We can't treat it wholly as a free market. It's a sort of community asset or a local asset. Boris Johnson's used those terms, embedded in the community. But on the greed or the fans issue, this is just absolute nonsense economics. We have been portrayed to us as being, Gavin Williamson said this seems to have been dreamt up by the money men for greed without having any concern of what the fans want. The only way, if you are a greedy football chairman, you can satisfy your greed, Iain, is to give the fans what they want.
Yeah.
We've sort of been presented as if it's either football for the fans or somehow JP Morgan are going to spend $5 billion a year or whatever it is, just so their senior executives can sit in a corporate box. I mean, that isn't the tension. And that's how some conservative politicians have portrayed it, Iain, no?
I think you're right. It is really interesting the way in which you think about the way in which the IEA was formed, where it emerged from, and the roots of it. In the early 1950s, the kind of anti-census thing, which was then a minority opinion. The campaigns by a small number of people against this overwhelming consensus, and we're now heading for having a consensus pretty similar to the one that you described, where sort of maybe 3/4 of the country has that attitude and thinks that profit is a dirty word, and the sort of greed is good thing, which ironically Boris quoted a few weeks ago, misquoting an enemy of capitalism, character in Wall Street. I think those who believe in capitalism, for want of a better term, though Smith wouldn't necessarily have associated himself with the term, are, I think, realizing, as those who are in favor of liberty have realized during the COVID crisis, that actually in a smaller minority than previously feared, and that those ideas are going to have to be refought for again in the next decade or two, because there is a settled big government consensus. And I know you're going to come on to talk about greenery, where to me that's the the biggest area in which it's happening. But I don't think you'll find you find some Tory MPs will grumble about it, I suppose, what's happening at the moment. But that is the modern Conservative Party. It's a long way from the politics that you would advocate, Mark.
Benedict, let me bring you back in, and we're going to bring in our next two guests while you're speaking, Benedict, Kate Andrews from The Spectator and Tom Whipple from The Times. This kind of greed versus the fans thing, though, right? I mean, I don't know whether football clubs or chairmen are necessarily greedy, but let's say they are. If Southampton Football Club are greedy, the way they will satisfy their greed is to give me more Southampton stuff I want to buy.
Yeah.
And the European Soccer League seemed to be, European Super League, whatever they called it, seemed to be a product the fans weren't going to buy. If you were a greedy money man, this was a very stupid idea. No, Benedict?
Well, I think they made a miscalculation. Florentino Perez, the president of Real Madrid, and it's very interesting that the English press are going predominantly after the three American owners of Liverpool, Manchester United and Arsenal, and not after the Italian owner of Juventus or the Spanish chairman of Real Madrid, who were the two people that were driving this. Perez said to the Spanish press, actually, we've looked at the demographics, we've looked at the figures, and the fan of the future wants shorter games. They want more stars playing together more often. This is what all of our polling does. Now, I have no idea where he got those figures from, but presumably that's what the demographics say. Of course, that doesn't take into account two things. One is that children grow up and they change their minds and they don't just play video games all day. And the second is that actually even those sort of fair weather fans, and this is a market, we're talking everywhere from sort of India to China to sub-Saharan Africa. This is what Perez and the Super League were aiming at, predominantly that market. But those are, if you like, to be a little bit unfair, they're perhaps less attached to the clubs than the legacy fans. That's what the Super League clubs called the fans in places like Liverpool and Manchester, who go to the match, who create the atmosphere. They're buying into that. Without those legacy fans, you don't have the same product, and you don't necessarily, therefore, have the same sort of fervor, and you can't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be the same thing, therefore, 10 years' time. Are people going to keep on being interested? Or will you get situations like you've had in Liverpool, in Manchester, after they were bought by American owners, where large swathes of the fans go to smaller local clubs like FC United of Manchester or Salford or Tranmere, and start supporting those as well. Just on the subject, greedy owners, I know that a lot of fans have been sort of calling for their owners to leave. What I suspect will end up happening is that, take Liverpool, for example, this summer, they'll go out, they'll buy an incredibly expensive forward that nobody else in the league can buy, say Mbappe, Haaland, that nobody else can afford. And they'll say, we're very sorry, and to show you how sorry we are, here is this shiny new toy. And the fans will go, oh, thanks very much. Well, we've completely forgotten about this massive outrage that we were very upset about. And so it'll continue. The financial doping will not go away. It's only when it's sort of immediately affecting you, as in this case, that it matters. But the rest of the league will sit on and go, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Nothing has changed for us.
Kate and Tom, welcome. Kate, you're from the great state of Connecticut. So obviously you're a staunch supporter of Newcastle United. Stands to reason. I'm very disappointed that, one could say this isn't going to go ahead. Your club and mine could have been competing in the higher echelons of the Premier League if we kick these 6 teams out. Most likely, yet again, both of us will be struggling against relegation in the Premier League next season. What do you make of this, Kate? I mean, some people were saying this was a sort of effort to make sport a bit more American, where actually sport is on a rather stronger financial footing than it is in Europe. Was this a good plan that people wouldn't listen to, or was this complete madness and free market capitalism and a consumer response has nipped it in the bud?
Well, I think you've been very generous to Newcastle United there. I'm not at all convinced that if the top teams got knocked out that we would be anywhere near the top. I don't think that money in sport is the problem. And I think a lot of people throughout all different kinds of sports are excited about the US branching out from baseball and basketball and getting more involved in football and other sports that dominate in other parts of the world. But if you want to talk about bringing in closed leagues that lack that competition and that grittiness that's so enjoyed by fans, then I think you're going to find the pushback that you found this week, that it's not the American money that people are necessarily opposed to importing, but it's the style and the structures that mean that certain people just get to hover towards the top, and you never really get that underdog sensation that you can get when, say, Leicester wins the Premier League. So I think I don't think it's so simple as to say it's a rejection of America getting involved. I think it's a rejection of certain kinds of structures. I mean, what really struck me this week is how wonderfully sort of market motivation changed things overnight. Fans pushed back. It was clear that this wasn't going to be marketable. It was clear that this wasn't desired. And so quickly, the Super League turned to dust. What's concerned me deeply is the extent to which politicians not only involved themselves, but thought it was appropriate to do so. And you have Boris Johnson talking about essentially rigging the market so that things like the Premier League will be successful. I think that this comes after a year of total state domination in every aspect of our lives. And whilst a lot of that, in terms of the furlough scheme, the generosity to make sure that people's livelihoods have been protected has been extremely welcome. And especially a conservative government needs to check itself about how we're going to actually operate post-pandemic in areas that, frankly, the state should have nothing to do with.
So you're with me, Kate. If we've got 6 inquiries into David Cameron and Greensill, we need a full public inquiry into the application of the offside rule, right? Let's actually get the government, looking at things that people care about. Tom, it's lovely to see you again. Welcome. This is what Tom said to our Director of Communications in an email when he agreed to appear on the show. He's having a bit of a pop at me here. Tom says, I'm a football skeptic with very little knowledge about Super Leagues, but that doesn't remotely stop me having strong views about how absurd they all are and the sheer arbitrary preposterousness of someone who grew up in Wokingham, deciding at the age of 9 to support Southampton, then hitching his happiness to what is essentially a mediocre company devoid of any link to geography. Tom, you don't get football at all. It's not about happiness. It's about pain and it's about loyalty. What did you make of this whole farrago, or is it just doubled down on your football skepticism?
I mean, you've just all gone completely mad. The thing that I don't understand about this is why everyone's suddenly getting passionate about how insane this thing is. So let me give you, and I might be completely wrong about this, but a sort of thought experiment, a bit like Hemingway's typewriter. Imagine that Southampton played Newcastle and Southampton won 1-0 and Mark was very happy and Kate's very unhappy. And then imagine the next week they swapped players, as apparently is something that happens. You don't have to be born in Southampton, Newcastle. They swapped the entire bloody team, and next week exactly the same team was played, got exactly the same result, but Mark is unhappy and Kate is happy. It's completely insane, and I don't understand how a Super League changes this total insanity. You have effectively just, I mean, I suppose for the IEA it makes sense because you're literally supporting a capitalist entity without romance, geography, or anything that would sort of necessitate this tribal loyalty. But it's mad.
But hang on, romance and loyalty have a place in the market, right? I mean, just our Southampton Football Club, how much of my money goes wasted on them every goddamn year? I'm paying for as you rightly say, Tom, I pay thousands for mediocrity every year. I mean, it's amazing what's available in the free market capitalist system. Mediocrity, pain, losing more games than we win. Don't you think, Tom, that romance, loyalty, fan allegiance it's been shown that the free market capitalist feedback loop is fantastically swift. This thing's been killed in 48 hours. I don't know whether Oliver Dowden has yet convened his government state inquiry panel of fan-led organisations, but he needn't bother now. The market feedback loop is brilliant and swift and kills products that people don't want.
I mean, it absolutely does. I just don't understand why this is particularly a product they didn't want compared to the previous products that seem manifestly absurd to me. But, you know, your psychology has been hacked in some way by this process to make you poorer and less happy as a consequence of your lifelong support of Southampton. So well done, capitalism.
Well, talking, folks, of things that make us poorer and less happy, greener pastures and carbon emissions having to come down. I thought I'd move on to this news story just to cheer you up. Could cost billions. Obviously, there's no price you can put on saving the planet and the human race. But Boris Johnson's new pledge is that we're going to reduce carbon emissions by a total of 78%. I think it's from a 1990 start by 2035, sorry. This means roughly halving our current emissions from where they're at today. We've currently already got them down 41% since 1990. So we've got to halve them again in 14 years. The UK government says they're going to enshrine this new target in law to slash emissions by 78% by 2035. Iain, what do we make of this? I don't know the science about it. I'm happy to agree with the mainstream science that carbon emissions can be bad for the planet. I haven't investigated it in any detail. Let's say that's true. Is this the correct public policy response to that environmental problem?
Well, I've actually just about an hour ago just filed my column for the Times for tomorrow, which is on precisely this subject. I just finished a book by fascinating guy, Steve Koonin, who was in the Obama administration, an illustrious physicist and a moderate skeptic. New book is called Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us and What It Means. And what kind of concerns me about this is the way in which, and we've just had a lesson, I mean, Tom's written brilliantly and extensively about all of this, tracking the whole story, but we've just had an object lesson in the last year about the notion of settled science, or about how our idea and conception of it in public policy evolves. And it just seems to me highly unlikely that the British government, certainly Boris Johnson's government, that can't organise a 2.6 million media briefing room without it turning into a 4-month farce, can have arrived at a policy position which will involve the complete overhaul of our economy in the next 14 to 15 years at a cost of somewhere between 1 trillion and 3 trillion, depending on whether you take the Treasury's numbers or climate skeptic numbers. And I'm sort of somewhere in the middle on this debate. And as Koonin makes clear in the book, just methodically, chapter after chapter, this climate science is relatively new, contested, and the models don't all agree. It suits politicians who want the models to agree to sort of smooth out the differences and in their press releases say that they say other things, and it suits some scientists to try and make a splash. But the result is we are at risk of completely uprooting our economy and the way in which we live for something which actually requires a very calm, reasonable response. I'm in favor of, lower pollution, rewilding, electric cars, great if it can be made to work. And as Koonin says, let the innovation happen, encourage sensible public policy. But the idea of a state-controlled, highly centralized, £3 trillion initiative to redesign our lives and our economy, organized by Boris Johnson, call me skeptical.
Benedict, let me come to you. I think I'm right in saying that although it wasn't obviously the intention of lockdown, that the consequence of lockdown, which has obviously massively reduced, air travel, people driving around, all sorts of activities have gone down. That's only reduced our CO2 emissions in the UK by 7%. This seems like a colossally ambitious or insane target, doesn't it? Is Iain right that this is sort of central planning gone mad? But I mean, I guess if these people think that they can solve the rules of engagement and who should play who in football matches, they also know what to do to save the planet, right?
Yeah, really, I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm often reading books about the old Soviet Union, just sort of as a pastime, and it does sort of strike you every time that you hear these sorts of grand plans, and you think, oh, it's going to be this target by this date, and you think, I'm sure it is. I think broadly, as Iain says, that there is a lot of scope to make arguments about sort of practical, sensible changes in policies and I suppose actually lifestyle in many different sectors, be it the amount of meat that people eat to sort of alter the farming industry, the industrialized farming industry, to how we travel, things like this. I don't think that there's anything wrong with these things in principle, as long as they are sustainable, as long as they don't actually cause any sort of regression in the standards of people's lives, because ultimately one has to continue to look forward. That's the whole point of being ambitious. If this government wants to have these incredibly ambitious targets, it can't be to make our lives universally worse. Really, I think the thing that concerns me, just to take your point about, the government wanting to sort of intervene in our lives, it has been the thing that happened ever since the first lockdown. Now, you can there are people who will make arguments for and against the benefits of lockdown to do with the coronavirus. That's not what I'm saying here. It is the fact that the measure to lock down the country was taken. It was thought at the start that the British people would never stand for it, but they did. And they've gone along with it again and again. And there have not been actual riots in the streets against it or anything like that. And you're kind of sat there thinking, so now you've got a government that is really quite keen to push these sorts of overwhelming, overarching policies about changing the way we live. And they've already got it into their heads now that they can get away with these sorts of things without necessarily getting the science right, as Iain says, because they've changed their policy on coronavirus as sort of as information has come up and, you know, pretended that they didn't say things that they did. They've got that sort of power now. And so you kind of think, well, is there anything that's going to stop it? Really? Because if people are happy, they're contented to be, without asking questions, or not enough people asking questions, to be sequestered in their houses and being told it's for the good of your own health. And then you're told, oh, by the way, there's this other thing that's happening, and maybe polar ice caps could melt and we could all sink, or maybe there could be more pandemics, or maybe you could choke to death on pollution. Those all sound like big, scary things. Maybe you might want to just do what we say. You can see that that's the direction we're going down. And on the scale that we've seen with the pandemic, you can see it being multiplied, you know, replicated on a much larger scale for a much larger period of time, if the climate crisis really is the be all and end all that the government says it is.
Kate, you're the economics reporter for the Spectator. If these sort of measures that we've experienced during lockdown were proportionate to the COVID problem, God only knows what measures are proportionate to deal with saving the planet, right? What should classical liberals and free marketeers say about this? Is this actually an area in which government targets and central planning is the only way to save the planet?
Well, so I'm going to be more optimistic than you, Mark, and perhaps the panel so far, because I think a greener planet with lower carbon emissions is going to be good for everybody. And I actually think it would be silly for free marketeers not to be at the forefront of this. Saying that these kinds of innovations to make us healthier, to sustain, and to make us prosper are a fantastic thing. I think the question, which has already been quite strongly hinted at, is whether or not the government's policies are actually going to create that, or whether or not they've taken that almost quite lazy perspective of politicians to sit back and make a deadline and then leave the rest to the market. And I guess this is my biggest concern, because it doesn't strike me as a government that has any intention of wanting to lower people's living standards. Boris Johnson recently, in an interview, I believe for The Sun, said he didn't plan to bring in any taxes on meat or carbon. Now, if you really want to talk about getting carbon emissions down, you should be talking about a carbon tax, but this is not apparently something that the Prime Minister plans to do. He does not want to acknowledge the trade-offs and the deadlines that he's setting in the way that it might impact us. So that only leads me to believe that he thinks that the market is going to step in and sort it out. Now, that's very often Boris Johnson's thinking in every area of public policy. The market does its thing, creates lots of money, and then I can spend that money on public services, and I can set deadlines, and I can have what I want, and it's a win-win. The problem is whether or not the technology is there yet, and also whether or not hearts and minds have been swayed to pursue this policy as aggressively as they want to. Look at the Green Homes Grant that was only recently announced. It's already failed. It's already collapsed. The challenge of getting people to re-insulate their homes and to upgrade their heaters and boilers is absolutely immense. We're talking about a lot of money. And the government, I think its biggest failure so far is to actually acknowledge A, what that's really going to cost, and B, what it's going to cost the individual. I think free marketeers should be at the forefront of this, saying that of course the technology is going to come, and we should be designing public policy around tax breaks in areas that are going to invest in green. And actually, I think a carbon tax is probably a pretty good idea if this is something we want to target. At least there's an honest assessment that businesses can understand when they're planning for the future. At the moment, we have a very muddled in between where the government is saying, well, here are our targets, but I don't really see in the public policy how they think it's going to be achieved, unless they think this technology can be whipped up overnight. It's just going to come out of nowhere. Maybe it is. I mean, the market's incredible, but they're banking on that. Or they're just not really being honest with people about the true cost of this.
Tom, you're the science guy. And in the new way that we make public policy, we look at the science guys to do Excel spreadsheets and graphs. The politicians then carry out any policies at all that they want to based on those graphs, and we, the adoring public, lap it up unless it involves our football team having to pay Barcelona and never being relegated. What's the science take on this? I'm not a climate change denier myself. I'm just trying to work out whether this is sensible public policy to deal with a problem, and whether there's any sense at all about the trade-offs or any discovery process, or as Iain says, whether we have the humility to agree that the totality of the science here and the scale of the problem isn't settled?
I would say that the minutiae of the science isn't settled, and the consequences of the minutiae lead to great uncertainties in both directions. There's reasonable probabilities of really quite catastrophic things, and reasonable probabilities of not terribly catastrophic things by the end of this century. The basics are, a lot simpler than viruses. It's just thermodynamics. There was a guy in 1938 called Callender who sat down with essentially a back of an envelope and predicted essentially the temperature rise we have now. CO2 is the reason that the Earth's habitable, and it's tracked every ice age and every change in temperature. So that bit's kind of fine. What we do, my worries, I've got a few worries about the target. One of the worries about the target is that some things are quite easy wins, but don't get us to the end goal. So if the end goal is 0, but there's an interim goal of getting close to it, you can do things, we've already done things like this, like replace coal power plants by gas power plants and make a phenomenal headline saving in carbon that actually bakes in fossil fuels for a lot longer.
Yeah.
And so the detail is really important, as is the detail of whether we're just exporting. So so I think last year about 350 million tons was our headline carbon export, which was down in the past 15 years from 600 million tons. So a huge drop. But if you include the stuff that we've just imported from other countries, the drop was about the same. So these large drops have actually been happening. But our true carbon output was about 550 million tons, so almost double what we're saying we're putting out. In terms of free market, that's where I hand over to you guys. There have been some quite big wins that seem to be backed by government subsidy. I'm sure there's been plenty of turkeys, but solar power is the obvious one. It's dropped from about £75 a watt to about 15 pence a watt. And a lot of that seems to have been to do with Germany having some quite clever subsidy schemes around the turn of the millennium. But also that is a straight win for the free market. Solar power is now the cheapest option in many parts of the world. So there are reasons to be hopeful. But as Kate said, the big thing in the UK that we're going to notice that we haven't really bitten the bullet on is home heating, because we're all gas, all of us.
Benedict, let me get your final thoughts on this. What should the aim be here? We've now got our mindset in the aim of a carbon target. Tom sort of says if the aim is carbon net zero, I don't have a particular aim in mind. I just want to save the planet. Maybe that needs carbon minus 2% or carbon plus 3% is viable. And maybe it needs to be done by 2030 or 2080. I don't know. I couldn't work those spreadsheets out. But are we just approaching this problem in wholly the wrong way? Do we need to get market solutions? Or is Tom right that actually some of these subsidies are actually working? The market can't do the heavy lifting.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach of actually having both of these things, of having the carrot and the stick, of having the government say, well, here's all of these sorts of benefits if you're going to be at the forefront of driving this sort of change, but if not, we're going to give you a hefty whack. Again, if this is what we want to do. I think the main issue that I have is if you want the market to do its thing, you need to have the public on side, you need to have the consumers on side. And so far, I think a lot of the narrative around climate change is incredibly negative. And I don't actually think it sits very well with a lot of members of the public. And that's because predominantly the people who have co-opted the argument are neither free marketeers, nor are they the sort of keep England a green and pleasant land sort of conservatives. They are the sort of the doomers, the people that say that actually everything is going to come to an end and we need to have complete intervention right now because it's a climate and we're going to terrify your children and shut down the tube. And I think really, even if you were to go down the path of having a market-driven solution, right now, I'm not convinced actually that the majority of people in this country, I think everybody wants a clean and healthy planet. They don't want there to be climate change, but ultimately too much of the narrative is stuck around this sort of fatalistic idea that everything is going to be a catastrophe. You need to give people something to aspire to. You can't just be perpetually looking at saying, if you don't do this, all of these bad things are going to happen. It has to be well, if we do this, then actually these things X, Y, Z will improve. If you talk about things like changing to largely vegan diets or having to get rid of your cars or all that sort of thing, people don't respond positively to that. A government telling you you've got to eat this or you've got to drive that, I don't think that's going to have any kind of positive impact. I think that that's going to have a backlash effect, if anything else. So I do think that aspect of the free market, of needing to take control of the narrative away from what is essentially government and campaign groups that are sort of on the same page, which is saying to everybody, bad things are coming if you don't do what we say.
Yep. Benedict, it's been lovely to see you. Iain, let me get your closing thoughts. Here's my worry in terms of judging the trade-offs, that government policies will start putting up, I don't know, airline tickets, your domestic heating bill, your petrol bill, but government policy won't get the blame for that. That will be blamed on predatory petrol companies and profiteering airlines, and the utility companies are charging too much. How do we at least get to a situation where we can start transparently seeing what the trade-offs are?
I wouldn't worry about that, because I think, look, it's politics ultimately, isn't it? And, I remember the fuel protests of, I think, 2001 with the Blair government, or 2000. And how that just blew up on the back of fuel price increases that seemed quite modest and almost brought the country to a halt. And you think of David Cameron, who began with the Huskies stunt and all that stuff, and Steve Hilton got into government, risk of a double dip recession, people furious about energy costs and all sorts of other things. And within a couple of years, he was talking about cutting the green crap, not a term I endorse, but if you remember, so changed his position. That's practical politics. The thing that I would worry about most in all of this, in terms of the ideological aspect of it, is corporatism and cronyism. Now, there's a big argument at the moment, isn't there, on the back of Greensill and how that came about the closeness of certain financial institutions to government, and those institutions saying what government wanted to hear, and then government having a sort of revolving door with those institutions. Now that was just on the back of some, relatively modest public sector efficiency savings that Francis Maude and others were seeking. This is 100 times that in terms of the potential for conflict of interest between financial institutions, investors, and government, with a revolving door working both ways. And we know that, and I know, speaking to businesses and to people in government, you cannot deviate from this consensus, from the Boris boosterism, that this is the policy we've decided. Now, that to me is the recipe for policy mistakes and potentially corporatism.
But Iain, you're very fond of where do you think the backlash comes? Will people say, I blame the Climate Change Act, or will they say, I blame, the Scottish Power for putting my bill up too high?
Well, the evidence is of the last 20 years that it does end up being directed at politicians, and that a newspaper like The Sun, for example, was very influential, and there are other outlets that could do it in directing the ire of its readers and its kind of readers against the government. Imagine a situation in which you come out of this, there's a boom, and then there is some kind of economic reverse, at which point people are really feeling the pain. Energy costs are rising. It's not that difficult then, to imagine a scenario in which a government becomes unpopular, or Boris Johnson changes his mind on the environment in two or 3 years' time.
Iain and Benedict, thanks for being with us. Tom, I know you've got to leave soon. Kate, stay with us. Tom, what are your thoughts on this? That whatever the necessary problem with decarbonisation over a number of years, how will we judge as it unfolds whether the costs are worth it? Whether we actually say, well, we're not quite going to make carbon net zero, but is it okay that we've reduced things by 96%? Because really, we can't have heating bills going up any further. More people will die of hypothermia, or it will just be, just too expensive. Can't lead a decent life if heating bills are that high. I'm really worried that we don't have a system in which these trade-offs will be transparent and obvious, and people can make judgments and perhaps decide that if we only get 99% of our way to the target that's set by central government, perhaps that's enough. Perhaps it's even too much. That's the unfolding discovery process we need, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would personally prefer this to be done through some sort of carbon tax. I think that finding a way to price externalities is a far more sensible way of doing it. My optimistic answer builds on things like the solar energy, where these become attractive. If you'd said 10 years ago that we all had to have electric cars by 2040, well, I think people did, and they were told they're insane. Now that looks like the attractive option. Like, I don't actually want to get myself a petrol car. I think we slightly underestimate the extent to which we've been stuck in this sort of stable state that's not actually that pleasant for everyone. And even on heating, I can come up with an optimistic scenario, which is we should all be insulating our houses anyway. If it wasn't for the fact that we're so bad at judging long-term spending versus initial capital costs, we'd have all done it. And then once you've done that, you might as well get a heat pump because it's a far more efficient way of heating your house once it's well insulated. There are ways around this that aren't too unpleasant, and there's a length of time that I hope it can be done so that it's not too unpleasant.
But market system pricing, the price mechanism could do that lifting if you get the prices right. Yeah.
I think probably, yeah, if you could get a carbon tax right, I do. People are against it, and certainly the Greenies are against it, and I think that's a shame because it seems to be. Look, I mean, you're the economics dudes, but it's a sort of classic market failure where you've got something where you haven't priced the externality.
The externality, yeah.
If we could, then hopefully all magic hands of whoever would come in and do their magic.
Yeah, well, Tom, on that happy note, you can see, Boris Johnson only takes his orders from me. I wish he took his orders from me and Kate. Tom, lovely to see you. Kate, I've got a bit of cheery news. It's half time and it's International Hotspur franchise 0, Southampton Football Club 1.
Congratulations.
Plenty of time to go wrong yet. But those are the really important things in life. On this carbon tax issue and the pricing of it, do you think we'll actually go down that path, Kate, that people actually say, well, this isn't sort of working, banning the diesel engine by date X or mandating solar power on this building by date Y? And if they want to continue down a very radical path of decarbonisation, they're going to have to use the price mechanism. Or to some of our other panelists' points earlier, do you think we just hit crunch point before then? People will just say, this is ludicrous. I can't afford to go on holiday. My heating bill's too high. I can't fill up my car. Stop this nonsense. And whatever you think of the impact of carbon emissions, it will have to stop because we're still in a democracy.
I guess that depends on how much belief you have in a government to think more than the next election cycle. And, at the moment, I would actually say I have pretty little faith in that. But if you were to go down a carbon tax route, and if you were to actually roll back a lot of the red tape that exists now that's just been piled on top of one another, not necessarily gelling together, and go for something more serious, more aggressive, but more straightforward that businesses could understand, I think you could actually see a lot of economic and green benefit from that. But at the moment, they're just not interested in talking about these trade-offs. I mean, I think something Tom said, he was talking about electric cars and how quite obviously now, if you were thinking about buying a car, this would be a serious consideration. He's absolutely right. But that we have very ambitious targets to moving to electric cars and getting rid of petrol and diesel cars in the future. And yet they won't touch fuel duty simply doesn't add up. And that to me speaks of a government that is not actually thinking about making tough decisions now, blunt decisions now that could benefit all of us in the future. It's a government that's very nervous to do so. I agree with Tom. I think there's a lot of merit in a carbon tax, but I'm not convinced we're going to see that overnight.
Len Shackleton, Professor Len Shackleton, delighted you could join us. Lovely to have you. Southport Football Club fan, I should also mention, these sort of, in the world of identity politics, badging people according to their clubs, very, very important thing to do. Len, what do you make of the economics around climate change? Is this an area of public policy where the price mechanism almost hasn't been reached for at all? To Kate's point, domestic fuel is, you can't say subsidized, but it's treated at a lower rate than other products as regard to VAT. And yet this is the sort of thing politicians. Why has it gone so madly wrong? And why is there almost nothing that the price mechanism's doing to try and solve and get us towards decarbonisation?
Well, I think governments think about this in the wrong way. The whole idea of zero carbon emissions, I mean, as an economist, you think, do we want zero things? Do we want zero unemployment? Do we want zero COVID? Do we want zero crime? Because, we can get to 95%, 96%, but that last 3 or 4% or whatever is going to be incredibly expensive to do. So I wouldn't even conceptualize it in that kind of way. I have some sympathy with the idea of a carbon tax, but it's not a panacea. It's a very difficult thing to set. We often don't know what the costs of particular actions are, and so on. So I'm not madly optimistic about all this stuff. I think it's politicians showing off. I think we've got this ridiculous children's crusade thing where people want to save the planet and don't really understand what they're doing when they say so. As an economist, I think there's lots of things we could do to reduce emissions and so on, but we tend to rule a lot of them out for kind of political reasons or whatever.
Like fracking or whatever.
Yeah, stuff like that. We don't like nukes. We don't like, there's all sorts of stuff which we don't want to do. And at the same time, of course, a lot of libertarians who we're in sympathy with are all burning Bitcoin, which is apparently, it uses the same amount of electricity as Argentina or something. This ridiculous thing which brings benefits to a handful of people, but it's difficult to see what the attractions of it are to the country as a whole.
But this is fascinating then, and obviously here at the IEA, we kind of put the art of the possible and politics aside as far as we can and get the right idea, trying to get the right idea, the right concept, and hope that flies. If you're skeptical about a carbon tax, and the way, I would have thought the way we'd implement it would be a bit like the Bank of England setting interest rates to beat inflation. You'd sort of dial it up if you had to because carbon emissions were too high, and dial it down if things are better than you expected. But I agree, its application is not entirely straightforward.
Well,
but if
the
not
carbon tax idea, of course, is it's a Pigovian tax. And, I'm kind of with Ronald Coase on this, that this is a sort of blackboard economics. We can, I've for 30 years, I've had A-level students trying to draw this diagram, which shows marginal social costs and marginal private costs. And there it is, there's a solution. We set the tax at that rate. But the fact is, we don't often very know what marginal private costs are, let alone what marginal social costs are. And, the attempts which have been done to run a carbon tax, like in Australia, have been abandoned because they've run into so many problems. So it's not a panacea. I think it's worth investigating. We should be looking at it carefully in the UK, but it's not something which is just going to solve everything overnight.
Kate, do you think there's any chance, and some of our other panelists have touched on this, that if you like, just entrepreneurial genius and tech will get us out of this problem? I don't know what that could be. Motor cars that run on tangerine juice, some incredible carbon capture and storage thing, battery power going up by a factor of 1 million. I don't know what new inventions could come on stream. But do you think, Kate, there's any chance that the marketplace, even if not properly incentivized with the right prices, could just come up with something that solves this, either by capturing carbon emissions or perhaps finding carbon intensive activity we do at the moment and being able to do them even better, perhaps in a low carbon way? Could that just render the whole thing moot, or am I just being a ridiculous dreamy optimist here?
Well, you're being optimistic, but all free marketeers are. If you think that, civil society and business and employers and entrepreneurs can solve the problems of the world, that's a very positive and optimistic view to take. It's so often the case. There's huge financial incentive to be the person who comes up with the silver bullet to this. It would be you would be probably the wealthiest person in the world. There are really exciting technologies around nuclear and carbon capture and storage that aren't quite there yet, but certainly could be. So I don't think you're wrong to be optimistic. I think the bigger question for politicians is, what if this doesn't work out on their timelines? Right? It's not even will the technology ever emerge, it's when that technology emerges. Number one, are they doing the right things to incentivize people to go about coming up with it? But number two, if it doesn't emerge on their timeline, then what do they tell the public? Do they push their timeline back, or do they make some really difficult decisions? And I think you can make the case for really difficult decisions. You can. And you can say that this is the priority. Boris Johnson thinks it's the priority. He wants environmentalism to define his premiership, not COVID. So you can make the case, but it's a tough one to make, because if the technology doesn't show up and reduce in cost so significantly that we can all afford it and live more prosperous lives because of it, then we're talking about, you know, a much more difficult time where people are sacrificing more. And you have to make that case. And nobody in government at the moment is willing to make that case.
I'm getting flamed in the chat. Mr. Simon Roll says, I can't believe the IEA is in favour of more tax. Others are saying that Peter Gill says capturing carbon dioxide would do nothing other than cost money. It would be far better to try pushing a boulder uphill. I have also heard it said that actually we do have carbon taxes in place at the moment. What's air passenger duty? Petrol tax is probably higher than the carbon tax would be. Anyway, okay, we've nearly saved planet Earth's environment. But I want your two takes, Len and Kate, on unemployment. This could be a problem coming up. Now, the unemployment rate isn't too bad at the moment. It's fallen by some decimal point, 0.1%. I think it's fallen to 4.9%. But payroll figures are dropping substantially, because obviously people are still on the furlough scheme, which was going to be very, very short term, and has been extended and extended and extended, and perhaps these are zombie jobs. Len, you're at the IEA, our labour market specialist and wizzo. I wanted to put to you a kind of optimistic case, and then you can shoot me down. When I was a lad, I was growing up with, you know, unemployment was the overarching issue. You know, I can remember it going through 1 million. I think under the Thatcher administration, it hit 3 million. It seemed to be structural. People could never get back into work. Whole communities collapsed, or the coal mining industry famously. Now it doesn't seem to be much of a problem. There's all sorts of labour market regulation, but people's, if you like, ability or tendency to lose one job and quite quickly find another. We've got incredible labour market flexibility, haven't we? Even if all these people are on furlough in zombie jobs suddenly have to come back in the labour market, isn't the present system's ability to reallocate labour so much better than it was 20 or 30 years ago? We'll find jobs from all. Nothing to see here.
Well, at times I'm optimistic about this. I mean, I share with Kate the view that markets can sort things out, but we are strewing a lot of things in markets' way to make it more difficult. And talking about the sort of people who lost jobs in the 80s with the closure of pits and things like that, they didn't get jobs back. It's a generational change which has occurred, and the kind of jobs which people do now, it is much easier to move from job to job and so forth. And I mean, one of the interesting things, I saw a survey a couple of weeks ago which suggested that more people than ever actually want to change jobs as a consequence of being at home. And that is actually a sign of a lively labour market, in a sense, that people want to move. And that moving out of particular jobs mean that you can repurpose that position or scrap it or whatever without any harm to any individuals and so on. So there are kind of positive things, but I don't know what's going on really in the labour market. You mentioned the payroll figures, but of course that includes people who are on furlough. We don't know what's happening to these people. There's this blob of 5 million people out there. Are there going to be jobs for them? When we look at what sort of occupations they're in, what sort of sectors they're in, I'm not madly optimistic about it. There's a disproportionate number in sectors which are clearly going to shrink. That high street retailing, arts, entertainment, things like that. It's going to be a long, long time before we get back to the sort of entertainment venues which we had and so on. So there are problems, I think, and the government really needs. I've plugged this line with you before, but we need to. Our model ought to be what happened to West Germany after the Second World War, when everybody thought we had to keep all these controls. That's the only way we can do things. But Earhart and his colleagues let the market rip. We're not doing this. We're still keeping all these restrictions and so on. The only interesting thing which the government said it would do, of course, is to liberalise planning, but is backpedaling on this already. And are we going to see the kind of liberalisation which we're hoping for? Or are we just going to, say, oh, well, the market will sort it out? Because, optimism's one thing, but stupidity is another, I think.
Kate, you're the younger generation. Len and I both way over the hill now. You're the future, Kate. 30 years old, already had at least 3 amazing jobs in your life. Is my optimism well founded? In fact, it might not suit me very well. I'm over the hill. I'm unemployable now. I've been working for the IA for 11 years. But the future is Kate Andrews, right? A whole range of jobs, a portfolio career, and a high profile by the age of 30. That's the way the labour market's going to be moving. Might be tough for Len and I, towards the tail end of our careers, but you guys have cracked labour market flexibility, jobsearch.com, findanewrole.com, gig economy. You're never going to be unemployed if you don't want to be, are you?
Well, I think you're the only person who thinks that's the future, but I'll take it. I am slightly less optimistic for the younger generations looking at the coronavirus statistics. It is the young that have been disproportionately hit, furloughed, put out of work. And whilst I don't think that it is a foregone conclusion that it will stay that way for a long period of time, they certainly have the toughest hill to climb in terms of getting back into the labor force. And actually on the other end of the spectrum as well, people who have been furloughed or put out of work around the age of 55 or 60 who weren't expecting to retire for maybe another 5 or 6 years and maybe will decide to do so early, that could have a big impact as well. I am broadly optimistic, but there's some major caveats to it. First of all, unemployment is going to go up towards the end of the year. The major forecasters do not think that we've hit peak unemployment yet. Now, granted, this has been downgraded drastically. The Office of Budget Responsibility thought last year we'd hit peak unemployment around 12%, and they've downgraded that to 6.5%. That's huge. And if we get through a pandemic in which the economy had to be shut down and we had to go into hibernation, with a peak of 6.5% unemployment, I think that will be a glowing review of the furlough scheme, actually, and the fact that it did save so many livelihoods. But as Len points out, there are 5 million people out there who don't know if their jobs are going to exist when they come back. So we should expect to see this figure go up, and obviously that means real human pain alongside it. And the other huge caveat here is that we still don't really know, even with the roadmap, how normal the 21st of June is going to look like. The government saved all of the difficult decisions, particularly around social distancing, for outside of the review, for outside the roadmap, for separate reviews and consultations. And if we have real freedom on the 21st, you can see this roaring back really quite quickly. But if we still have the 1 meter plus rule, if people are told that they should still work from home wherever they can, if we still have quite severe COVID guidance and even restrictions in place from the 21st of June, then we are in a very different territory in terms of all those people in hospitality and the arts sector that Len mentioned being able to come back in that really aggressive way. So I just don't think we know yet, based on government policy, what's going to be feasible. There's a really exciting circumstance where it's possible, and then there's a really negative circumstance where maybe that peak 6.5% unemployment that's currently forecast actually goes up.
But don't you think, Kate, that hospitality, at least in the short term, when we're able to go back to it, will boom like crazy? I mean, if it is June the 21st that you're allowed back into pubs, all right, maybe you have to stand a yard away from the next person or whatever it might be. But then on July the 1st, you can pack in as many people into nightclubs and football stadiums as you want. At least in the very short term, I guess the novelty will wear off. There's going to be a huge boom on this, right? I mean, I think on the first day that drinking was allowed outside, somebody compared what was going on in Soho to VE Day 1945 in terms of the now that doesn't carry you over forever, but if the hospitality sector has survived, or bits of it has survived, they're about to hit pay dirt, aren't they?
Oh, if we can go back to cramming people into pubs and bars and restaurants and football stadiums, yeah, we should expect a massive boom. And a lot of households, not all, but a lot, have had the opportunity to save money. If anything, the chancellor around his budget was slightly concerned about the inflationary risk if we had such a big boom. But that the question is if, Mark, it's not guaranteed. So if that is the circumstance, fantastic. I agree with you. It will be a wonderful opportunity for businesses and tourism to come back and for us all to cram in and spend our money on pints together. But when we say you might have to stand a meter away from somebody, that is not a casual ask of a business. We're talking about reducing capacity by maybe 25%, by maybe 50%. And very quickly, your business is no longer profitable. You just cannot work at those margins. So actually, those decisions are absolutely vital for whether or not these businesses can continue to thrive. And the obvious knock-on effect there is whether or not the labor market suffers or is successful as a consequence.
Len, you've written a lot.
It's not just the restrictions, though, is it? It's also that behaviour will change. We're already seeing people saying they don't want to go into work anymore. Now, if that happens on a big scale, that's a collapse of sort of stuff going on in the inner city, restaurants, bars, anything like that. Also, I think a lot of people are still spooked by all this stuff. And, possibly the older generation, but a lot of other people as well, will be very reticent to enter crowded bars and crowded theatres in the way in which they did in the past. It's not just the government rules. The government has actually, over 12, 13 months or whatever, has actually drummed into us that we're not safe with each other. We have to steer clear of people. And it's a worry to me that is going to continue, whatever the government says.
But the kind of the cultural effect, Len, the cultural effect.
Yeah.
But Len, you've written a lot for the IEA on labour market reform. We'll put some links in the YouTube chat and in the show notes to a wide range of your pieces. Are you suggesting on the labour market that kind of what you like to see is the government taking the Hippocratic oath, first do no harm, or do you have some kind of reform in mind? What's the Shackleton magic bullet policy? These are the two things I would change that might not solve every problem, but if they're not a silver bullet, at least it would be a bronze bullet.
Well, I've written quite a number of things about this. I mean, one of the areas I keep on banging on about is occupational regulation and the way in which that makes it difficult for people to enter a whole range of fields which they might want to do, after changing careers, etc. during following the pandemic. So there's things like that. There's a whole load of very minor things by themselves, but which collectively make it expensive for employers to take on new labour, particularly young people without a record of experience and so forth. For example, the pension auto-enrolment scheme, which I think should not start until you're 25, quite honestly, because for people younger than that, it's just not worth doing. The returns on it are very low and so forth. But it's a cost to the employer. And there are loads and loads of these costs to the employers, which we should look getting rid of. I mean, one very thing I've been arguing for recently is abolishing employers' national insurance for people under the age of 25 as well. There are things like this which will just make it easier for employers to sort of take on somebody. It's maybe a bit of a risk, maybe a bit of a problem, who knows? Let's try them out. Look at different ways of being able to get rid of people, for example. I know that sounds bizarre.
Sounds counterintuitive, though, right? Make it easier to fire people. It sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, this is what, as you know, this was considered in the early days of the Cameron administration, because countries like the United States, which find it easier to fire people, also find it easier to hire them, because you're not taking on such a permanent risk. So there's a number of things which might not be immediately popular, but which I think would open up the labour market. And as Kate says, there is this fantastic power amongst businesses to create jobs and so forth. But government is constantly trying to outwit them by introducing yet another barrier to taking people on. So, and we've seen several of these in the last few years, and there are more in the pipeline. Look at ethnic pay monitoring, for example. That's something which is coming down the road, and which we'll find very difficult to avoid, I think. Lots of things like that.
And Kate, of course, you while you were here at the IEA and since have commented a lot on gender pay gap and the monitoring thereof. Kate, what's your prescription on the labour market? I mean, sometimes, I love looking at all the texts about it. I wouldn't have a national minimum wage, for example, but I kind of think that boat has sailed. I need to find another way around this problem. I don't know whether that's more people becoming self-employed rather than employed, therefore the national minimum wage doesn't apply. Kate, are you worried about how restricted the labour market is?
The media.
What are the policies that would free it up? And are any of those policies palatable? I agree with everything that Len said, but the minute a politician says we need to make it easier to fire people in order to hire people, that policy is probably, dead on arrival.
Yeah, it probably is. I'm amazed that we haven't seen more moves this year on employers' national insurance contributions. I think that there is public policy that the government can tinker with that's not politically toxic or difficult, that would make it easier to hire people. I think I know that there's a big emphasis on reskilling. Will the programs actually work is another question, but they realize that coming out of this, there are, as Len was speaking to, going to be different preferences. It's not just about whether or not you can do something, it's about whether or not you'll still want to, and they're going to try to put a lot of emphasis into reskilling. But we've seen what's happened with apprenticeships in the UK, and the more government involvement you have, the fewer opportunities there have quite a drastic fall in the opportunities for apprenticeships as the government meddled. So I'm slightly skeptical of the schemes that they bring in, and more in favor of just getting some of those barriers out of the way. Look, if we really reopen, and the vaccine data so far, appreciate everything keeps moving, things could change, but the vaccine data so far is so exciting and successful. If we can really reopen, and the furlough scheme, thankfully, seems to have played a very large factor in keeping employment relatively low if you compare to the United States. Certainly, even if you compare to the European Union, employment figures have been manageable. And we have a real chance of the market just being able to do what it does best and getting people into work. The question is how long this interference lingers. And businesses were remarkably resilient and innovative in lockdown. And the fact that you have not seen another spectacular fall in GDP this winter, despite being in a very strict lockdown, is testament to the extent to which businesses, just reformed and changed and managed to make things work. They've done that several times now for a year. We cannot continue to ask them to do that for several more years, because not only will that destroy them, but it really will have a huge impact on the jobs market in a negative way.
Okay, you're not really going to say furlough's employment, right? I mean, it's just an extraordinary, if you like, unemployment benefit, or intended to be a very short-term unemployment benefit. The idea is that you return then to your job. We just don't know yet how many of those would have died.
Oh, no, it's certainly not employment. And that's why everyone expects that employment is still going to go up. Even it won't make loads of sense on the surface of it. Things are open again, and yet the employment figure is going up. That's because people will be coming off furlough, and we're going to discover some of those jobs don't exist. But look, I think the furlough scheme really over the past year has, well, so far anyway, proven to be a success in terms of the way that you could subsidize people and the state could step in. I think it's one of the most free market ways you could do it. You're not saying we're going to take a chunk of your company, we're going to nationalize you so that you can get the subsidy. You're saying we're going to allow you to hibernate so that when we reopen, the private sector can thrive again and hopefully keep as many people in work as possible. If you compare that to, say, what's happened in the States, where people were forced to go home, this wasn't an option, lost their jobs, and were reliant on stimulus checks that for many, many people were not going to come close to paying the bills. I think the UK pursued the better option. So I'm not trying to say it's employment. I'm trying to say if we are able to open, I think it will have been a success for the year that it was needed.
Len, I'm just going to finish with you to go back to the top of our show. Are Southport now minded to apply to join the Euro Soccer League? There are a fair few slots there. You could be playing AC Milan and Real Madrid day in, day out, right? I mean, have you got your application in yet?
I don't want to go on an away trip like that. Somewhere, north of Manchester is a bit more my style, I think.
And are you glad, Len, that the whole project seems to have died a death? I was arguing.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you saw my T-shirt, I don't know whether viewers can see this, but there you are.
Stuff your Super League. Stuff your
Super League. That's the message to take home, I think.
That is the message to take home. So yeah, the Super League is stuffed. It's gone. The free market killed it off pretty quickly. That's what customers and consumers can do in a mere 48 hours, much faster than any Oliver Dowden-led fan-based inquiry. Done, dusted, strangled at birth. The bad news is it's now International Hotspur franchise 1, Southampton 1. They've equalised. Even worse, it was Gareth Bale. We launched him on his career.
Yes, a long time ago. Yeah.
I can just about live with that. Kate, Len, it's been fantastic to see you both virtually. Thanks so much for joining me on this program. I hope it's not too long before we can have a beer in a pub rather than just talk through the internet. But it's been great to have you both. My thanks too to my cousin Tom Whipple, Benedict, Spence and Iain Martin, who joined us on our program earlier. There's plenty of upcoming stuff on the IEA channel. If you've enjoyed this show, please hit the thumbs up like button. And if you're not yet a subscriber to IEA London, hit subscribe and the notification bell. I'll be back in this very chair at 1 o'clock tomorrow on a new research paper we're releasing, Eastern Promise, assessing the future of UK-India trade, with IEA fellow, and it's the author of that pamphlet, Shankar Singham, e-bookers founder Dinesh Dam-Ija, and the Conservative Member of Parliament, Imran Ahmed Khan, as well as our very own Lord Saeed Kamal, our acting academic and research director. I'll also back in this chair on the 26th of April at 6 p.m. for our In Conversation event with Steve Barclay, MP, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And we have a great conference for you. It used to be expensive to go because it was bricks and mortar. Now you can actually sign up and attend for free online. Our Think conference is on June the 12th. There are free tickets for the virtual event. A whole range of speakers, including Tim Harford. We'll put the information on the YouTube channel and in the link below. So subscribe, hit like, hit the notification bell, come to Think. We'll see you again soon. Kate and Len, thanks so much. Have a good evening, everybody. Over and out.